Hopefully, all of you who are online, raise your hands so I can tell that you can hear me in your living rooms or wherever you're watching. Welcome to the special creative session with Professor John Bowers, whose latest book, Tolkien's Lost Chaucer, will be the subject of a discussion with myself and as many of you here or watching online who wish to participate. My name is John Gawain, and I'm a past president of both PAMLA and, in fact, the New Chaucer Society, but I guarantee that many or even most of you are more expert on Tolkien than I am. So I encourage you to lend your voice to the discussion part of this program. I suspect we will go for between 30 and 40 minutes, and then we will handle questions from those of you in the audience, both here and around the world, really, because of the way Hoover is set up, thanks to our wonderful tech crew. John Bowers is a great expert on, I also wanted to mention that the plenary session is going to follow this session, and it will be in this very room, so you don't actually have to move very far. John Bowers is a great expert on both Chaucer and Tolkien. He's taught Tolkien as part of the Great Courses series, which is available through several platforms, as well as the Great Courses site itself. John is professor of English at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. He's a specialist in medieval English literature with books on Chaucer, Langland, and the Gawain Poet. His books have really turned upside down much of our received wisdom about certain authors, such as the Pearl Poet or Piers Plowman. He's won many teaching awards, including the UNLV Foundation Distinguished Teaching Award. His latest book, Tolkien's Lost Chaucer, which I've just put up, I'll hold it up yet again, has been published by Oxford University Press and will be the centerpiece of our conversation with him. His articles span the range from St. Augustine to Shakespeare. He was educated at Duke, Virginia, at Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar, and actually we may ask him a little bit about his experience with academic descendants of Tolkien when he was at Oxford. He taught at Caltech and Princeton before beginning his career at UNLV in 1987. His work has been supported by fellowships from the NEH, from the Huntington Library, from the Bellagio Institute of the Rockefeller Foundation, which I'm especially jealous of, and the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation. His Great Courses series, The Western Literary Canon in Context, was released in 2008. He is also a novelist and has published a 9/11 story and has completed his Iraq War novel, Legion of the Daggerstone. Some of you may remember a book called The Scholar Adventurers by Richard Altick. It used to be required reading for a previous generation of scholars, and it was filled with stories about lost manuscripts and happy accidents that changed the way we think about certain authors or works. My favorite part of it is when Eugene Van Ovid discovers the Winchester manuscript of Mallory's Mort Author, and it has been sealed into a wall at Winchester College, and he begins working on it in some cottage somewhere in the Midlands of England, and Lawrence of Arabia who is now retired, decides that he would be a great collaborator and gets on his motorcycle and drives I think actually drives to the college to see if he can talk them into letting him edit the Mallory's Mort Author, which had always inspired him and which was a kind of model for Seven Pillars of Wisdom. That's the kind of thing that is, the stories that are told in the Scholar Adventurers. And I actually think that John Bowers' discovery of Tolkien's Lost Project on an edition of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales would certainly qualify for a chapter if Altick's book were being written today. So I'd like to begin by asking John a question about the book itself, which is Most of us associate Tolkien with Old English literature or with Norse literature. So why haven't we thought about him very much in relation to Chaucer, who for most of us is the most famous medieval English poet in the canon? But that's it.
I guess that's how we're doing it. Hi, I'm John Bowers, and first of all, I want to thank John Gannam for arranging this session and for others to attend with us today live and online. And it's a good question about how Tolkien really did not have a reputation as a Chaucerian. And unlike other sort of scholarly discoveries like the Winchester manuscript of Morte Arthur, this is even more mysterious in the sense that Tolkien's life and career are actually better documented than just about any other author in the canon. He spent most of his life in academic institutions. One thing we're very good at is generating paperwork. We know what committees he was on. We know what teaching schedules he had. We know what PhD students he supervised. All of that was kind of known. There was an authorized biography that came out by Humphrey Carpenter. There were letters edited. And I think that what happened is, number one, there's like a 12-year gap in the collected letters of Tolkien, and that 12-year gap really kind of corresponds with the period when he was working on his Chaucer edition in the 1920s and so on. Also, his son, Christopher Tolkien, was so responsible for getting his father's work into print. He was only 4 years old when his father gave up on the Chaucer project. So it's something that he wasn't really aware of. In fact, Tolkien himself did so many projects that dead-ended that Christopher himself didn't always know about all the work that his father had done. And then, of course, people don't go around bragging about failed projects, and the fact that Tolkien didn't finish this, didn't get into print, is the sort of thing he himself wouldn't have much talked about. Even with a close friend like C.S. Lewis, who was able to finish his Chaucer work that was in his book Allegory of Love. And so there's a lot of reasons why Tolkien himself wouldn't have much advertised this during his career, and it got overlooked along the way. And I have to say, I was very much sort of an armchair adventurer when I started teaching Tolkien, and I came late to this only after the Peter Jackson movies began appearing, and what they call a film firster with Tolkien. There's this extraordinary publication by Christina Scull and Wayne Hammond. It's a guide and chronology to Tolkien. And volume 1 is really a kind of year by year, almost sometimes day by day, tracing of Tolkien's life, career, and so on. It's extraordinary. And so I just, was able to sort of, lay back and read through this chronology volume, partly because it's an extraordinary kind of history of medieval studies at Oxford and in English departments generally in the 20th century, that kind of back and forth between language and literature, with Tolkien kind of ending up on the losing end of that struggle as literature displaced language in most English departments during his career. And that's where I began noticing references starting in 1922 to his work on the Clarendon Chaucer. They quoted from correspondence in the Oxford University Press archives. And then finally in 1951, they quoted a letter where he really grumpily acknowledged that he was returning all this material unfinished back to the press. So the next phase of this, very easy in the modern world, just start doing some emailing. And emailed the archivist at Oxford University Press. He very quickly emailed back and said, yep, I went to the basement and there I found it, kind of shoved into a corner. It is totally accidental that a dropped project from the last correspondence, 1960, that it wasn't just, tossed at some point. Because Tolkien was not a really, superstar name, even by 1960 in England. But for some reason, it, kind of lost in a dark corner of the basement. It kind of, survived. And so it was just a matter then to go to Oxford and see what was in the box that had surfaced. So not quite so swashbuckling as T.E.
You
Lawrence.
see, I had a picture of you going down and saying, "What is in there?" But no, it happened virtually in a way that's really quite postmodern.
Yeah, as I say, research, during the lifetime of some of us in the profession has just morphed so much. And in fact, a great deal of my work, certainly now, is conducted right here in Las Vegas with digital scans of manuscript pages that the Tolkien archivist at the Bodleian Library has been generous enough, with permission of the Tolkien estate's lawyer, to provide for me. And especially with COVID, they've been especially accommodating for that ongoing research, because I'm doing a follow-up book called Tolkien and Chaucer, 1913 to 1959. And it really begins with some student essays that he wrote during his undergraduate career, and ends with his valedictory speech from 1959 on his retirement. We actually talked a lot about Chaucer, within the curriculum. So it shouldn't have been so surprising that, it was one of his interests. We have to remember, in terms of medievalist profession, that we've become very specialized by this point. And so Anglo-Saxon and Middle English are very separate now. We're talking about doing searches, and now we would do a search for somebody in Old English or Middle English. But in olden days, I mean, a medievalist was.
But even in our generation, we were trained in both.
Yeah, we were expected to know the Old English and Middle English, and it's become even more specialized, so that you're either a Chaucer specialist or a Langland specialist, and then medieval drama has become its own kind of separate field. But in Tolkien's day, they were expected to do pretty much everything, and so this shift back and forth between Old English and Middle English, not really. The real surprise is that Tolkien in 1925 was hired or appointed as professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford, because he had published zero on Old English literature in 1925. The runner-up was Kenneth Seisen, who actually published a couple of really important articles on Beowulf by that point. And in my reading of all of this, what do we need?
Nothing, just you guys talk, just turn it like you did. Nice.
Oh, great, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
You don't have to lean into it.
Technical assistance. And I think that, as I say in the book, product placement, that his co-editor, George Gordon, who was a real mover and shaker at Oxford, may have sort of finagled his appointment, partly because their joint editing of the Chaucer edition had bogged down because we're doing this long distance. Tolkien at that time was at Leeds University, and so the idea was get him to Oxford where they could do some supervision and elbow-to-elbow work. It may have been sort of the hidden factor in Tolkien getting this plum appointment. He was only 33 years old, which is very young, to become a professor at Oxford or Cambridge in those days, and got him there. And then he was required to lecture in Old English, Gothic, Icelandic, and all the rest. And that's really kind of how we imagine him. But before that, when he was at Leeds, he routinely lectured on Chaucer's language, general prologue to the Canterbury Tales. So it really was part of his portfolio before that time.
Yes, I like two things in reaction. What is John was talking about, how manuscript study has now become virtual, especially the detail we can see it in. And I think for our generation, we're perfectly comfortable with that, having dealt enough with physical manuscripts, and I should say that John's edition of the 15th century continuations of the Canterbury Tales is one of the things that younger scholars turn to as a kind of model for interesting new ways to find the byways of literary history. But I've discovered that my younger colleagues who are working on manuscripts miss touching manuscripts and holding them. And they have a kind of a much more essentialist notion of what a manuscript is, and really feel a kind of nostalgia for the physical presence of the manuscript. And so it's kind of an interesting shift in a kind of almost kind of lost civilization sense of oh, if I could only touch this manuscript, I would understand everything about it, and kind of almost magical sense of things. And I also love the story of Tolkien's career being guided by people like Kenneth Sison and George Gordon and so forth. And, as my father used to say to me, it's not what you know, it's who you know. And in some sense, Tolkien's career is a kind of exemplar of that. I wonder, since there are a lot of people listening to us who know a great deal about Tolkien's most canonical works, like The Lord of the Rings and like some other of the Hobbit stories and so forth and so on. One of the things that John discovered was, I think, that there were echoes of Chaucer throughout Tolkien's fiction, and we just didn't recognize it. We didn't see it because we never associated Tolkien with Chaucer. So maybe you can highlight a few of the scenes and characters and such that were inspired in Tolkien's fiction by his encounter with Chaucer.
Sure. And when they were doing the student edition, Clarendon Chaucer, the original plan was to put the Prioress's Tale in the collection, and the co-editor, George Gordon, who was very politically minded, said, the anti-Semitism was a problem, we better leave that one out. So instead they put in the Reeves Tale, and then the sex stuff got to be a problem, so they only used the first half, ending with the dinner at the cottage, and left out the double rape scene later on. So Tolkien had to focus on the Reeves Tale, and this is where he began to appreciate the dialect humor there, where Chaucer had used northern dialect to sort of make fun of the provincial Cambridge students there. And then in 1939, he was invited by poet laureate John Masefield actually to dress up as Chaucer and recite from memory the Reeves Tale. And he had done it in the previous year, he had recited the Nun's Priest Tale from memory, which I think is really impressive. I mean, there's a lot of proper names and so on in the Nun's Priest Tale. But he had dressed up, he had a false beard and all the rest. And he, the previous year they said it was hard to follow along the Middle English. So in 1939, he prepared a program with printed text of the Reeves Tale. And he actually did this very experimental text where he abandoned the printed text by Skeat and abandoned the Ellesmere manuscript as a copy text and just confected what he imagined Chaucer's authentic personal language was really like. Really, nobody has done this. I think it's extraordinary kind of experimental addition. And then he found himself in 1944 during World War II. They kept the university up and operating during the Second World War instead of closing down as they did during the Great War. And he was teaching cadets, Navy and Air Force cadets, and he was using the Reeves Tale, as a teaching text. Anyway, so this turned out to be exactly the time when he was composing that part of The Lord of the Rings where Merry and Pippin go to war against Saruman in his evil kind of mill-like industrial pollution home in Isengard. It's that sort of imaginative connection between John and Alan in their confrontation with the bad miller outside Cambridge, sort of imaginatively morphs into Merry and Pippin, though in his sort of fantasy recreation in The Two Towers, the two young hobbits actually end up on the winning side in that confrontation, whereas in Chaucer they get beat up and bloody and have to make a run for it at the end. But you can actually sort of see that interplay between the scholarly work in 1944 and the fictional version of it in The Two Towers.
Yes, I was very taken with that part about teaching the military cadets and choosing the Reeves Tale as what you teach them, because we've had friends who've taught at the military academy, Joe Tuso at West Point and John at Annapolis, and I get a sense that they emphasize the heroic, the Knight's Tale and Beowulf and so forth and so on. And the Reeves Tale is like, what you do when you're about to be court-martialed is what the Reeves Tale, and so I'm so amused by that.
Yeah, I think the principle of selection when they were doing the student text was to incorporate those Canterbury Tales about students. And so that's why they're going to do the Prioress's Tale about the little clergy on the Christian student boy. And then they substituted the Reeves Tale about the two Cambridge students. So they wanted that kind of identification. And I think during 1944, Tolkien was actually moving in the direction of doing a freestanding student edition of the Reeves Tale. His 1939 version had been bowdlerized. They took out the sex scenes and so on. But I've actually found a copy of this where he's interpolated all the cut scenes from 1939. And then he did a glossary list, and he did a list on the grammar of Chaucer based on the Reeves Tale. He really was moving in the direction of a student edition that, like so many of others projects, didn't quite make it. I want to go on public record. I mean, I used to hear when I was at Oxford, people said Tolkien was the laziest man I ever met. And the record really is, he wasn't lazy. He was incredibly hardworking. Number one, it was kind of out of sight. He tended to work late at night. And number two, he just didn't finish a lot of projects. So it looked like he was unproductive, but he was in fact incredibly hyper creative and left so much material that his son Christopher, published 12 volumes of the history of Middle-earth, and then right up to the end of his life, Christopher was publishing stuff that his father left unpublished during his lifetime.
The comment about the bowdlerization reminds me of a kind of paragraph in John's book, in which I think it's A.C. Spearing, Tony Spearing, talking about being a student in the 1940s or 1950s and being given Sizem or somebody's bowdlerized edition of the Nun's Priest Tale. It was somebody's Nun's Priest Tale, and encouraged with all the naughty bits, ... And it encouraged them to actually go and find the real text.
And then being disappointed.
They were disappointed that it was so brief and sketchy, and it was about chickens anyway, right?
And going back even further, my thesis supervisor when I was at Oxford was Rosemary Wolf.
Wow.
And she told me that when she was a girl in a girls' school, that they actually had an edition of Chaucer that left out all the naughty bits, all the fablio, and all the rest. And so her concept of Chaucer was totally skewed from her girls' school days, thinking very much in terms of moral and religious Chaucer. And Rosemary Wolf's career, and she wrote on the religious lyrics and religious drama, and so it totally sort of became a trajectory for her career, her own career as a medievalist, having this kind of sanitized version of Chaucer from school days.
But it is interesting, isn't it, that the question of what you include and what you don't include was intensely political, as it is now. So, for instance, Bob Lunionski, Robert Lunionski, who taught at Tulane University in the late 1940s, did an edition of Chaucer in which he could not bring himself, and it was it was used in many, many universities, could not get himself to include the Nun's Priest Tale. in that collection. He had been one of the, during World War II, had been with one of the units that liberated the concentration camps. And as a Jewish scholar, he felt like he simply could not encourage people even reading the Nun's Reeves Tale, which is very interesting because I think a responsible lot of other even immigrant intellectuals would know you can't do that. But Lunionski, as an American, felt like it had to be. It was almost like a kind of a wartime strategy. Yeah.
One thing I came to appreciate is Tolkien's own self-censorship throughout his career. He was a Catholic. At a time, there was still a lot of anti-Catholic prejudice, including institutional bias at Oxford. And so he really shaped his career by focusing on works like Beowulf and Sir Gawain the Green Knight that had a minimum of kind of Christian theological content in it. And I was noticing in his draft notes for his Chaucer edition, he makes a lot of references to Piers Plowman. He really knew Piers Plowman very, very well. And it was actually written in a dialect, the Worcester dialect, that he considered kind of his mother language. This is where his mother's family was from. And yet he never taught Piers Plowman. He never wrote on Piers Plowman because Piers Plowman is a thoroughly religious poem. You have to wade into issues of theology and all the rest. And as somebody who really kind of covered up his Catholicism throughout his career, that was just something he wasn't willing to risk. I mean, even his friend C.S. Lewis, always talk about papists, kind of associates papists with Irish and so on. And so there's tremendous kind of
the kind of casual prejudice that we would be shocked by.
Totally.
That certainly was true in the United States in the 19th century, early 20th century.
Yeah. And there was a thought, even when I came of age, that there were people, nuns and so on at universities, and their publications were kind of discounted because they were true believers in the religious content of Chaucer or Langland or whatever. And you just set them aside. Well, they're nuns, they're priests. And,
So where do we find Chaucer allusions, Chaucer references in the fiction?
The one that I'm very taken with now is Tolkien's engagement with the Pardoner's Tale. In 1945, he was appointed Merton Professor of Language and Literature and suddenly found himself obligated to lecture on Chaucer after a 20-year hiatus. And one of the set texts was the Pardoner's Tale. And so in 1947, he started lecturing on the Pardoner's Tale. And then in the early 50s, every academic year, he was lecturing on the Pardoner's Tale. And there's a really interesting shift. In the late 40s, he said this is one of the best of Chaucer's writings. He really was high on the Pardoner's Tale. In the 1950s, he really does a 180-degree turn, and he's extremely critical of the construction of the tale and so on. And I think what happened as he was ushering Lord of the Rings into print in the early 1950s, he suddenly realized that he basically told the same story as the Pardoner's Tale. It culminates with three men wrestling each other over a golden treasure, and they die. In his version, only the bad one dies, Gollum, wrestling Mount Doom over the gold ring, and the two good guys make it, except Frodo gets his finger bit off, but otherwise the good guys survive. He had told a kind of happy ending version of the Pardoner's Tale, and so he wanted to fault Chaucer on the way he had told this tale. And I'm actually editing the final version of Tolkien's Pardoner Tale lecture, which he copied out pretty clearly. And he did something 1955, 56, which he never did in other lectures. He did narrative analysis. Normally, Tolkien just did words, words. is usually he didn't tell the students even what line the poem he was focusing on. But he went back to the old 19th century Chaucer Society sources and analogs, and the origins of the stories about people killing each other over a gold treasure, and he criticized Chaucer. So, the story is top heavy. The beginning of the Partner's Tale takes a long time to get going there. But it's a kind of projection. He criticizes Chaucer for doing much the thing he did. I mean, the prologue to The Lord of the Rings, kind of heavy going before you actually get to the story itself.
It's actually a criticism. I mean, it's the kind of criticism or the kind of literary analysis that he himself criticized earlier in his career.
Oh, yes.
He kind of moved towards the very kind of forms of literary interpretation and standards that he would have rejected earlier on when he was a true philologist, as W.H. Auden calls him in that poem.
In fact, in the famous Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, he roundly criticizes source hunting. The famous allegory of the tower, where people are pushing over the tower, to find where the blocks of stone came from. But that's what he's doing with the Partner's Tale, going back and finding the early Sanskrit analogies from ancient India, and again, making the point. Not in the lectures, we can only appreciate this in retrospect. He's patting himself on the back, that he did it better in Lord of the Rings than Chaucer did it in The Partner's Tale. And Fellowship of the Ring had just come out, so there was nobody in the audience who could call him on it. I kind of got onto this. There's a fantasy writer, Diana Wynne Jones, and she wrote about attending those lectures. And said, Tolkien was doing something he never did before, which is narrative analysis in this. But she herself, a future fantasy writer, did not know in 1955 about, Fellowship or Return of the King and so on. And as a kind of nice irony, she ended up married to John Burroughs, the medievalist.
Oh, that's right, of course.
Yeah, and so she was sort of inspired by the Chaucer lectures to become a fantasy writer, and John Burroughs kind of inspired to be a medievalist. And so both coming out of their sort of encounter with Tolkien in 55, 56.
There are actually lots of little byways in your book that I'm interested in. I'm not sure whether this is just an interest in academic gossip, but I was kind of, and I know that Tom Shippey talks about this a little bit in his book, but you get a sense of a growing distance between Tolkien and some of the other Inklings, and perhaps Tolkien himself was always a little bit different than everybody else. But then it kind of, was there to drift apart between C.S. Lewis and Tolkien? I mean, obviously Tolkien relied on Lewis. Lewis kind of regarded it. Lewis had an attitude. Lewis was almost like his agent in the sense of trying to get him to continue writing and to have faith in what he was doing. But after about 1940, that seems to have changed.
I think that split between the famous friends and collaborators, Lewis and Tolkien, comes a bit later. In fact, during the 40s, C.S. Lewis was, really a champion and a pusher to get Tolkien to finish Lord of the Rings. And Tolkien admitted that support was absolutely essential to making the project possible. But then moving into the 1950s, a variety of things happened. Tolkien, who was instrumental in getting C.S. Lewis to convert to Christianity, then did not like the kind of popularizing of Christianity that C.S. Lewis in his writings and his radio addresses was fostering. Tolkien wished that C.S. Lewis had really gone all the way and become a Catholic. He didn't. And then also, Tolkien thoroughly disapproved of Lewis marrying the American divorcee, Joy. What was her last name?
I'm sorry, I can't remember her last name.
She was divorced, she was Jewish. He really didn't approve, as a Catholic, he didn't approve of that marriage to a divorcee. see. And so that sort of drove a wedge between them also. And, you know, it's sort of sad to admit, as he grew older, Tolkien became more and more cranky about everything. And, you know, all testimony is that he also drank too much and expressed really kind of outlandish opinions in public places and all the rest. So, you know, that sort of crankiness that comes with the aging process.
Well, it also comes
John
with,
and I are
it also comes
with
with making a lot of money from your books. So,
but then he was cranky about how many taxes he had to pay
Yes.
for the royalties that were beginning to come in on his books. In fact, he had to sell his manuscripts to Marquette University to pay a tax bill, you know, for the, and he sold these manuscripts for $5,000 in contemporary money. And, you know, manuscripts of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings have probably fetched a lot more these
exactly.
days.
Yeah.
You know.
Some of the same conflicts occur later on with the film adaptations and media adaptations, and the Tolkien estate goes back to court. Maybe we probably know those stories in and out.
And he sold the film rights early on, again for a relatively small amount of money, because he thought it was impossible to adapt and film Lord of the Rings at that time. There were no special effects that could do it. And so that's why the Tolkien estate has been very aggressive. Peter Jackson and Val Mershon want the video game rights and, you know, all the kind of spin-offs as well.
I wonder if this is a good time for to handle questions from the audience. If people here have questions, we can sort of begin answering them. And I will see if we have anybody on Huva who is telecasting questions in. I'm not sure that I'll be able to see them or not, but I will do my best. Yes, thank you.
Yes, I was curious, why do you think Tolkien gave up on this project? I know that one of his general difficulties was his perfectionism, as it took him years to write Lord of the Rings, and that was because of his perfectionism. And so I could see that being part of it, but I was curious if you had more information about why he gave up on the project.
It's a complicated story. On the other end, his collaborator, George Gordon, was not fulfilling his part, which was an introduction and so on. But Tolkien himself seemed to have a kind of compulsive obsessive disorder. He just couldn't stop. And so he was given some 20 pages of notes, drafted 160 pages of notes. And then he was a sort of non-finisher. Even at 160 pages, he hadn't drafted notes for the monk's tale or for the nun's priest tale. And so he had overdone the first part and then was unable to complete the rest of the project. And that is such a continuing failing in his career. Overdoes things and then doesn't complete them. The Hobbit wasn't finished when C.S. Lewis first saw it in 1932. It didn't have an ending to it. And again, Lewis had to push him to put a conclusion in the Battle of the Five Armies in The Hobbit. And then, if you notice, Lord of the Rings, just can't stop stopping. There's another, the famous story, the Hollywood premiere of Return of the King. And Jack Nicholson was there and left early, showed up at the party, and he was asked why did he leave the movie so early? And his response is, too many endings, kid, too many endings. Which is a good critical response to Lord of the Rings. And the book has more endings than the film has. So Tolkien had, and then he criticized Chaucer for not being good at the conclusions of his tales as well, kind of the classic projection.
There's sort of a sense of a disapproval of Chaucer as time goes by.
And pretty much a disapproval of colleagues, what he had to teach. As I said, kind of crankiness that became more extreme with age and the rest, which you and I would know.
No. This.
Just a point about the endings. Of course, the book has those long appendices at the end, but I think in the prologue, doesn't Tolkien say the only thing that he would change about the book is it's not long enough? Because I mean, creating a universe works like that. There's probably wrote so many other things he wanted to bring in he could.
Oh yeah, he wanted to integrate much more of the Silmarillion material, and he sort of shoehorned it in whenever possible, like that long monologue that Aragorn has on Weathertop, kind of doing prehistories of things, and Tolkien would have wanted to put, and then he kept sort of shifting that into the appendix, and then he had to cut the appendix, and then it was just kind of this loose material that it was up to Christopher Tolkien to cobble together as a Silmarillion in the 1970s. And one thing, someday we'll have access to all of Tolkien's papers. That's a really interesting question, when those other papers, because Christopher must have had a huge cache of his father's papers with himself in the south of France, where he spent the last decades of his life doing this editing. So there'll be diaries and letters and drafts, and we will see that the 1977 Silmarillion is very much Christopher's Silmarillion. And the one obvious thing about it is that Christopher only edited the prose versions of these legends. Tolkien usually wrote poetic versions of all the stories. Christopher only edited the prose versions. Someday all of that will be available for us to look at. And as I say, there's a dozen-year gap in the letters. And one wonders why that kind of oversight, that I think purposeful exclusion of a dozen years. And again, we're kind of curious what will eventually come out.
I was curious about what was Tolkien's response to the depictions of sexuality in Chaucer, because there's not a whole lot of that in Lord of the Rings. Tolkien definitely describes deep love between people, but not sex, and that there's a lot of sexuality in Chaucer. So I was curious about how Tolkien felt about that.
Yeah, have to remember that The Hobbit is, rather obviously, than The Lord of the Rings, grows out of a kind of boys' adventure genre that kind of got out of hand. And, the standards of the boys' adventure is no sex, please, we're British kind of attitude. And if you kind of notice in The Hobbit, there are really almost no female characters. There's Lobelia, Sackville Baggins, but that's it for named female characters in The Hobbit, and really not many in Lord of the Rings as well. And so, pretty much just left out, even though there's romance and courtship. I think of Faramir and Eowyn, kind of a courtship, which in the book I argue is kind of rewriting the Troils and Cressida's story, except that Faramir is kind of like Diomed. He's a much more aggressive courter of the lady love, a romance against the backdrop of war. But then there's tons of marriages at the end, but as you say, no sex. Just it's almost like a Jane Austen novel where everybody gets married at the end, but you don't have honeymoon nights described.
But even compared to C.S. Lewis, who's really tries to be in his own way frank about the relationship between eroticism and love, it almost seems to be scrubbed out of Tolkien's work. Even the scholarship is, he doesn't, I don't think he would ever, he would have liked to have left everything in because Chaucer left everything in. So it's a little bit hard to tell what would have happened if he actually had completed the edition.
And even in 1944, when he's teaching the cadets, he's still using that expunged version of the Reeves Tale that he'd offered to a general public in 1939. He did reinsert all of the excise passages, which includes the double rape scene, but never really got to around to publishing that if he ever intended to.
It's also true that I think a lot of the things that we think about when we think about Chaucer today probably were not yet formulated in anyone's thinking. I mean, The Partner is a terrific example. the fact that we think of the partner as a homosexual character, or probably more accurately as a queer character, that may have been there. That may have been there in the sort of the unconscious of everyone's interpretations, but I'm not entirely sure that it would have been something that that Tolkien would have had to face or address.
Yeah. It's not something that he brought up in his 1947 lecture on the partner, but then in the early 1950s, he does talk about the partner as a noxious character. And I think it's in line with number one, the homophobia of the 1950s. I mean, the Lavender Scare in this country and elsewhere. But also there was a sort of famous review of Lord of the Rings by Edwin Muir, who accused Tolkien's hobbits of being not men, not true men. And it's kind of a euphemism, they're not manly. And so Tolkien kind of recoiled from that, and again did a kind of projection onto Chaucer's character in the 1950s that hadn't been there in the late 1940s.
Well, it's interesting that Neville Coghill, who co-edits editions with Tolkien, with Christopher, I had not known until reading John's book that Coghill was gay, and that Coghill not only is famous for all of those modern English translations, which were the most widely adopted translations used, for instance, in American high schools to teach Chaucer, probably in England also. But he also wrote the musical, The Canterbury Tales, one of the most widely produced musicals, small theater companies, in high school theater companies, and so forth and so on. And actually, the next time it appears, I've seen it a few times and try to avoid it whenever it comes up because I've seen it too many times. But now I'm going to have to watch it again to see if there's anything of Coghill's own experience in it.
I just wanted to, we're not sure the Q&A is working live. Is it working live on the Whova? So if anybody wants to text in to me a question, you can text it to 626-354-7526. Somebody has actually a question for you though, which is about the two versions of The Hobbit. And the earlier version, which is much more a trickster story, right, in a lot of ways, and the later version where he revised it for it to fit in better with the Lord of the Rings. And then what I would add to that, the question I would add to that is, does any of that humor that's there, sometimes very, very nicely, especially with around the hobbits, less so around the humans or the elves, do you think he's getting some of that from his reading of Chaucer? I mean, whereas C.S. Lewis is not a funny writer, I think, ever, but Tolkien is. Tolkien can be quite humorous and playful with his characters, especially the hobbits and the dwarves somewhat, and obviously the Gandalf. So do you think I guess we'll broaden it out, but does that humor maybe come from his reading of Chaucer, that ability to move from, or maybe from Shakespeare too, from high to low, serious drama to epic to comedy, and what else do you think he gets from Chaucer, from his reading of the other writers that he's reading, these other classical and medieval writers? And then another question I had, and I'll just throw it out here so if you want to answer it, which is there seems to be this weird, interesting bifurcation between his writing as a medieval, like a late medievalist writer, but then sometimes there's very modern moments, especially I think with Gollum. The whole thing of Gollum seems very much influenced by sort of Freudian psychoanalytic ideas of the split personality or id, or I don't know how we want to say it. So do you see Chaucer, do you see Tolkien as more of a medievalist who's out of his time, or do you see him as more of a modernist, a contemporary writer who's very interested in the medieval? I don't know if that difference is important, but...
Let me see if I can remember all the strands of the question.
There's the trickster, revision, comedy, and high-low culture.
Okay.
Other things influenced by earlier writers, and sorry, that was too many questions, I know. And,
There's only really two versions of the Hobbit, and the only real difference is the episode with the Finding of the Ring. And in the original version, they had the riddle contest. Bilbo kind of cheats a little bit, wins, and gets to go his merry way. And Gollum is actually a pretty good loser in the original version. And then there's a revision of that chapter after Tolkien has finished Lord of the Rings, and he now realizes how crucial that particular episode is, rewrites it quite thoroughly, and now Gollum is not a good loser, tries to kill him on the way out, and Bilbo only scarcely gets out. So there's two versions, and in the prologue to Lord of the Rings, Tolkien has to account for the two different versions, and actually says, oh, well, there was one version that Bilbo told to Gandalf and the dwarves at the time, and then the later version that Gandalf got out of him. And so there are actually two different versions attributable to Bilbo himself. So this was Tolkien's kind of slippery way to account for both of those. In terms of humor, a little more on the Hobbit than the rest, I always tell my students that from Chaucer onward, the British literary tradition is basically a humorous tradition. The canonic writers and works of the British tradition are funny. Whether it's Shakespeare, who can't even write a tragedy without putting in the comic interludes. You've got Jane Austen, you've got Dickens, right on through the tradition to Monty Python, the great landmarks of British. And it's kind of interesting, Terry Jones, one of the Monty Python guys, was actually a student at Oxford. Terry told a joke, a funny story, about attending a Tolkien lecture. He was a brand new undergraduate at Oxford, and he showed up and he said he couldn't understand a word Tolkien was saying. It was very typical. Tolkien spoke fast, he mumbled. Halfway through the lecture, Tolkien stopped, reached in his pocket, pulled out a pair of dentures. He had forgotten to put in his false teeth. And once he put the dentures in, Terry Jones still couldn't understand what Tolkien said. And there are a couple of recordings of Tolkien that you can find on YouTube, and you'll see how hard it would have been to follow, especially without microphones and audio equipment and all the rest. But there's this sort of a connection between Tolkien and even the Monty Python group. No wonder Monty Python and the Holy Grail is so authentically medieval, because Terry Jones was in school taking medieval literature at Oxford. He was a member of our new Chaucer Society.
It was.
Would show up and do papers and skits and all the rest. It was a very, very good college.
Yes, wonderful.
There was a third question that I don't think I got to.
About the
just
modernity.
other influences from older works that you see on Tolkien. And then my other question was, do you see Tolkien as more of a modernist who's interested in the medieval, or a late medievalist?
First question, the work of Tom Shippey really was sort of consciousness raising for us, because it so much emphasized the need to know Tolkien's academic work in order to sort of trace those influences. Famous example, early on he had glossed Sir Orfeo for Kenneth Sizen's student anthology, and then he himself was editing it, translating Sir Orfeo. It's available now. And you can see how those ingredients, which were authentic medieval fairy lore, then get into the Hobbit. I mean, the Wood Elves in the Hobbit owe a direct debt to what we find in Sir Orfeo as an authentic medieval source. And that's why I think that the Chaucer is such a wonderful new ingredient in that, because we have a whole archive of source material which has been unrecognized and under-evaluated in terms of Tolkien's source work.
Yeah, I think the fragments of Tolkien's Chaucer that John includes in the book, if one reads them carefully, because I was reading them just to say, like, what is really going on here. They're technically superb, especially in terms of language. But what they do is, I think, a kind of double move. One is that by immersing himself in the very, very details of language, he sort of goes back to the 14th century. But he also, it's like a seance. He makes Chaucer come alive and seem very modern in that way. So there is a kind of double move going on in terms of his medievalism and in terms of his modernity. I mean, even the great Beowulf, as I write, reads in retrospect as a kind of tract about 1938. So I think it's a dual, constantly a dual awareness for somebody who presented himself really. He never quite says what C.S. Lewis says, which is that C.S. Lewis, calls himself posthumously published, right, in The Discarded Image, that he considered himself a dinosaur. He's not a modern man, he's really a kind of medieval man. But I don't think Tolkien ever says that, and never even taught it.
I would also make the point with my students that Tolkien is a great example of T.S. Eliot's notion of tradition and the original talent, where he's the author of the really new body of literature that then redefines the prior tradition. We have to remember 100 years ago, Beowulf was not in the syllabus. But you need to know Beowulf to understand the Smaug episode in The Hobbit and so on. And again with Sir Orfeo, that was sort of for graduate students when we came along, and now it's in the Norton Anthology in the original Middle English, which I think is pretty terrific also. And again, I think Tolkien's fingerprints are really all about that inclusion of Sir Orfeo in our current syllabus.
I had a question. I'm interested in you bring up this performance of a kind of seance, right? And I think there's an interesting parallel between that and dressing up as Chaucer and reciting the Reeves Tale. There's this kind of sense, I guess, in what you're saying of him kind of embodying Chaucer to a degree, but then at some point he rejects Chaucer. Where does that rejection really? You talk about him potentially rejecting him. Where does that happen? Is there an answer for why that happens? Because it seems like you'd have to be so close to it, right? And that would be kind of, I think, fairly difficult to do. Being so close to something to say, oh, no more, or oh, I did it better, or oh, this isn't good enough. Do you know kind of what point that happened?
We were talking about this in email because I think very much he embodied Chaucer in the late 1930s. He dressed up, impersonated Chaucer, and even in the late 40s when he's lecturing on the pardoner and the clerk and the Parliament fowls, he has a sense of kinship with Chaucer. It's only when he recognized that Chaucer had used the same archetypal story in the Pardoner's Tale, Chaucer becomes a competitor. And if you read Tolkien's publications, like the famous Beowulf, he always sees the need to demolish predecessors. He has to make every prior Beowulf scholar and critic wrong. And so you see that reflex pushback from predecessors into his Chaucer work in the 1950s. Chaucer now has become kind of the antecedent threat that he needs to tip over from the pedestal.
We have another question online from Curtis Grunler. He asks, do you see any connection between Chaucer's criticism of church institutions while depicting some Christian ideals and Tolkien's expression of faith or Christian themes through stories told in a world almost without religion? So I guess the question is there a parallel there between, again, I would rephrase it a little bit, between Christian idealism and Christian and some satire of actual practices?
Interesting, one of the sections from the Reeves Tale that he cut out in 1939 was that whole reference about the local priest being the grandfather of the miller's daughter, and his plans to embezzle the endowment of his church to provide her with a dowry to marry up in society, church corruption. And Tolkien cut that out. So it wasn't only sex, but also criticism of the church. And there's at least one fairly long note in his Clarendon annotations in which he had to confront that. And his thing is that corruption within the institution of the church did not undercut, the validity of church practices and the priesthood and the clergy generally. Just a few bad apples.
I should also say that, at least from what we can tell, Tolkien discouraged or ignored the study of heterodox movements within late medieval religions, such as the Lollards. I think discouraged his own students from working on it. There's supposedly refused to work with students who wanted to write dissertations on Piers Plowman, even though he himself knew it very well. So there was a discomfort with the satiric criticism that you find in Langland and Chaucer, which was really just run-of-the-mill medieval discourse in some ways.
Yeah. And of course, this carries over to the fiction. There is no religion in Middle-earth, not even a version of pagan. Of course, in the Silmarillion, he has this cosmology and the angelic orders and all the rest, but that really doesn't get much into the Lord of the Rings. There aren't pagan temples and all the rest in his Middle-earth. Though I always tell my students, watch the wind in Lord of the Rings, because very often there's a change in the direction of the wind, and there's a sense that this is the intervention of the Valar, this kind of angelic order, and the Dunedain, know about this, and they will actually kind of invoke the names of the Valar, but nobody else seems to know about that. But this change in the wind, for example, when the Black Fleet needs to go up the Anduin River to arrive on time at the siege of Minas Tirith, the wind changes. And people sort of notice the change in the wind. But that's about as much, as you can say about, divine intervention in Middle-earth.
Yes.
So I'm really fascinated that you came to this film first.
Yeah.
I would like to know, I'd like you to fill that gap for me about what happened to you when you saw those films and then you were motivated to approach or reapproach the text. What was that dynamic between the film and the text for you that motivated you on to what you've done?
Yeah. What's not to like about the films? I mean, they're really, really well done. And even the script adaptation is really expertly done, I think, what they've left in and what they've cut out from the film adaptation. And now it's become kind of an official adjunct to one study of Tolkien. It's almost what you call paratext. So you have the literary text, but then you have the other things. And Tolkien's work is already kind of characterized by paratext. His introductions, his footnotes, 100 pages of appendices, glossaries of names and all the rest. And so the films then become that posthumous paratext. So that, especially in teaching, anyone who's teaching Tolkien wants to embed some hyperlinks to clips from the film to illustrate, sometimes by contrast. I always point out to my students that Tolkien really sort of downplays battle scenes in his novel, partly because he was a survivor of the Battle of the Somme, and so he didn't romanticize that. So Peter Jackson has to really expand the battle scenes, like the charge of the Rohirrim at the siege of Minas Tirith. That's like one page in the text. Peter Jackson, with all of his computer-generated images, is able to make that quite an extraordinary moment in the films.
To follow up with that, so I was the opposite. I read the books first and then I saw the films as an adult. And I really didn't like that glorified violence and the expounding of those scenes
Mhm.
And so I'm wondering how you reconciled that, or if you even had to, because you saw the films first.
I think the original text is fairly dark as well. Tolkien embodied a pessimism throughout his career and talked in real life about the long defeat of history. And that's an outlook that he transfers to Galadriel, who's been eyewitness to the long defeat over the 3 ages of Middle-earth. And then that kind of sadness at the end, the departure of the elves and wizards from Middle-earth at the end. And there's going to be no more enchantment in Middle-earth. Tolkien actually tried a continuation of Lord of the Rings. He only got about 20 pages into it. It takes place 100 years after the fall of Sauron and the Dark Tower. But it was just so dispiriting. There wasn't any enchantment or magic, just the world of men, which gets to be a pretty nasty affair of competition. And it really believed there was a kind of a darkness in human beings that still sought out, the remnants of Sauron's darkness in Middle-earth. Any other
Do we have
online
any other
questions?
questions from?
Yeah, there's one about environmental issues, which I would just paraphrase this way, which is, this seems to be the worry about the loss of the pastoral and the move toward like a dark industrialization seems very central to Tolkien. But is that a very contemporary concern only, or is that found anywhere in older texts? Where does that come from for Tolkien? Is that a contemporary concern only, or is there something inherently, I guess, long-term English or British about that?
My experience is that you really can't find that literary concern with the degradation of environment. There's historical accounts. In the late 14th century, there are complaints in Parliament and in the Chronicles about what a filthy, disgusting, polluted place London was, that they just dumped the leftovers from the butcher shops out of the streets, they threw sewage into the Thames River. There are complaints about the stink in 14th century London. But I don't much see that as getting into the poetry of the period, except to the extent that Chaucer doesn't situate his stories in contemporary London. The Cook's Tale is the closest to that, but it talks more about some social problems, wayward apprentices and all the rest, but not so much a kind of pollution of the cityscape. Is that your experience also, John, that these environmental issues, and Tolkien is very much aware of it. On the one hand, he saw the devastation of landscape on the battlefield during the Great War, which he sort of brings over to the dead marshes, very much a kind of recreation of the battlefields at the Battle of the Somme. And then he's finishing this work in post-World War II England, which was just a sort of a chemical wasteland because of military production, no concern for the environment, chemical pollution, ugly buildings. And so what you see, it's cut out of the movies, if you talk about the darkness that isn't in the movies, the return to the Shire, and houses have been cut down, and trees have been cut down, and polluting factories have been built where there used to be a nice clean water bill. So that's a kind of projection of the industrial pollution that Tolkien has, but I really don't see that in authentic medieval literature, unless, John, you can come up with examples.
No, I think in fact it's probably more to do with medievalism. That is, I think that something like, I don't think he was crazy about William Morris's medieval tales, but the utopian, the News from Nowhere, which is a future socialist England, and everything's been cleaned up. It's a kind of green party fantasy of England, and there's something of that in in Tolkien's concerns.
I have one more question. And you may not be able to answer this, but you say at one point, like, about Chaucer, that what is it included and excluded is intensely political, right? That was mentioned in the talk. That there's this gaps were in Chaucer that informed other people and their worldviews. But you also you spoke about this 12-year gap in Tolkien's letters. Is there any hint as to what's in that gap, and why that's excluded, right? Because that is always, I believe, always political. What's gone, right, from those pieces? There's no indication of like why those are gone, or.
Some people suspect that he filled his letters with complaints about his home life and his marriage. He and his wife. It's one of these situations he sort of fell in romantic love when he was young, and then found out he was married to a woman who didn't share his intellectual interests, who wasn't all that interested in his career. It resulted in a kind of compartmentalizing of his life. He had his family life in the North Oxford suburb, and then he had his university life, and there was no overlap. As far as we can tell, his wife only once ever showed up at his college. It was an anniversary luncheon that they hosted. Only one time was his wife in any way participant in his academic side of things. So we suspect that Christopher and the rest of the family did not want that sort of airing of an unhappy marriage and home life. So we suspect that was an ingredient in the letters from that missing 12 years.
But when he does retire, he retires to, is it Bournemouth?
Bournemouth, yeah.
And partly, I think, because his wife preferred living there, preferred living that kind of life, preferred having some money.
And she could have friends down in Bournemouth, which kind of recreational retirement community. Tolkien had his own motivation for leaving Oxford. He was kind of famous, and his telephone number was listed. They'd get calls in the middle of the night from America. He would show up at the front door uninvited. And so when he retired to Bournemouth, he had a privacy and could get an unlisted phone number. And then when his wife died, he moved immediately back to Oxford, and his college, Merton, gave him a flat right there, had dining privileges. He would sit in the garden. He really kind of enjoyed all that.
Do we have any more questions from
None that I see. Oh, good. We have a question in the room, though.
Yes.
I was curious, you mentioned that we have detailed records of all of the dissertations that Tolkien supervised. Did he supervise any Chaucer dissertations?
I'm doing a sort of quick flip through of my memory, and I don't really remember any of them. Even though he was supervising dissertations by people, including my own dissertation supervisor, V.A. Coghill, but Coghill was working on medieval drama, and they had sort of one awkward year because Tolkien didn't know a whole lot about medieval drama, and so he was also in the process of retiring. So Coghill went on to become a very distinguished Chaucer scholar and critic, but at that point was doing something other, and that's when.
Yeah, medievalists are pretty good about who worked with who. We have these family trees in our heads, or like baseball teams, we kind of can tell you what the percentage was in somebody's batting average in 1984, and I blank out totally on anybody who actually worked on Chaucer with Tolkien.
But I am always very quick to tell my students that this makes me Tolkien's grand student, and it makes my students here at UNLV to be Tolkien's great-grand students. And so they're part of that academic genealogy that, as John said, used to be much more distinguished. I mean, you were known by
Who you worked with.
who you worked with.
Yeah. I think this is probably a good time to stop, and if people want to talk to John informally.
Well, we do have one more question,
Great.
actually.
Thank you.
It's about his theory of the eucatastrophe. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. The eucatastrophe, the kind of idea of the eucatastrophe, and is where that, how that played out in his life, and also how it how it may have come out of his reading of early Christian works, but it seems also maybe to come out of sort of idea of Stoicism, perhaps, as well. So I thought maybe you could talk about that.
The term eucatastrophe, a good, overturn, is a term he inserted in his 1939 lecture on fairy story, which is described as the joy of the happy ending. And what you see is, as a fantasy writer, we like happy endings. And so he would rewrite stories. As I say, the Reeves Tale has a kind of unhappy ending for the two boys who get beat up, but he's able to make that. In fact, there's a long period in Lord of the Rings where you think Merry and Pippin are dead. They've been kidnapped by orcs. They were part of the slaughter that the writers of Rohan did outside Fangorn Forest. But then they're found alive at Orthanc. Now, Tolkien himself was part of 4 young men who went off to the First World War. They were close school friends, and 2 of them were killed. So this is kind of a wish-fulfilling fantasy for Tolkien that he could bring back the 2 friends, presumed dead in the First World War. And as I say, his rewriting of the Partner's Tale, where all 3 young men are killed in their wrestling over the gold, he makes it a eucatastrophe so that only Golem dies and the 2 good guys survive that, and eagles come, whisk them away to safety. And so he put those eucatastrophes into his own work because he knew we like the joy of a happy ending.
Yeah, it just also seems always to me, maybe this is what's always resonated for me, is this idea, maybe I'm misunderstanding the concept of, even when things don't look like there's no possibility of them working out, you keep trying to do what you think you're going to do. And then if it does snatch from defeat victory, there's something sweet about that because you've been doing the right thing, the ethical thing, or the moral thing against all possible odds, like with no hope of, it almost seems like he entertains despair in a way that, despair is supposed to be a deadly sin, but it seems like Tolkien does entertain the idea of despairing yet going on. And, but I'm probably misdiagnosing his term there, or maybe overreading his term.
When I teach Tolkien, I use the Norton Critical Edition of Beowulf, which includes Tolkien's lecture at Tolkien, the Monsters and the Critics. And I always make out that what he's saying about Beowulf is really very applicable to his own writing. And that's that kind of heroism in the face of obvious defeat. And you do it not because it might turn out, you do it knowing that it's not going to turn out in your favor. He sees that in Beowulf, and he absolutely translates that. You have the March on the Black Gates, certain defeat at the Black Gates, but it's done as a diversionary effort to give Frodo and Sam time to get to Mount Doom.
Yeah, and I know Tolkien was very critical of could be critical of C.S. Lewis, maybe very critical is too strong, as being too allegorical.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't find persuasive the readings of the Ring as a nuclear bomb or whatever, facile readings. But I do think there's no way to read these moments without thinking about his First World War experiences.
And also, I think when you read the Beowulf essay, you can hear the Spitfires in the background.
Yeah.
I mean, there really is a prescient essay, very much of its moment.
Yes, in the 1930s, England wasn't at war, but you could see it coming.
See it coming.
Very
That
obvious.
last sentence, until the dragon comes, is, I think it's read now as almost like prediction, predictive statement. I'm afraid we had better stop now because we only have 20 minutes to set up for the plenary session. I want to thank everybody who's here and also everyone who is online, and thank John and Craig and Martin for helping to set up this wonderful session, and thank you.
And this is what we do on Zoom, isn't it?
We can do whatever one does on camera. I think the camera may still be on.
Huh?
Is the camera still on?
I think we stopped, right? Oh, we're going? Okay.
We don't
So everybody's hearing my
We
words.
don't want to do one of those things that get people into trouble.
Jeffrey Tubin,